so excited to talk American history. I'd like to open our lecture with a story that goes back to 1824, when Faneuil Hall hosted the Marquis de Lafayette. As many of you know, Lafayette was a French aristocrat who went on to do great things in the Revolutionary War. Undoubtedly, most of us today hear his name and immediately start picturing that beautiful fountain that we have of him downtown in LaGrange. On one of his tours of the United States, the city of Boston had invited him to come to a coffee house for an event in his honor. As the guest of honor, Lafayette eventually stood to give a toast. I would like to imagine that he adopted a pose similar to our statue, except in this case, he likely had a cup of coffee in his hand. He toasted, quote, "To the city of Boston, the Cradle of Liberty. May Faneuil Hall ever stand as a monument to teach the world that resistance to oppression is a duty and will, under true Republican institutions, become a blessing." Over the course of the 1800s, that moniker, the Cradle of Liberty, became attached not just to the city of Boston, but to Faneuil Hall itself. So let's get to the origins then of Faneuil Hall. The building was constructed back in 1743. The bottom floor was made up of a marketplace, while the top floor contained a large meeting hall. Establishing Faneuil Hall alleviated several of the problems facing Boston in the early 1700s. When I visited Boston back in 2017, I found it easy to walk around and explore the sights, especially compared to some other big cities. But if I were to somehow travel back in time to the early 1700s, I would find that moving around the city was a whole lot less pleasant. Boston's roadways were dangerous and overcrowded. Street peddlers, who had a reputation for engaging in shady business practices, were everywhere hawking their wares. When stationary, the peddlers and their carts congested the walkways and drew customers away from established shops. But when those carts were moving, the peddlers' wagons, laden with goods, would tear up the roadways and come dangerously close to pedestrians. In the 17 teens, it was tragic, but not all that surprising, when a street peddler's cart toppled over and killed a 14-year-old boy playing nearby. A famous Boston preacher by the name of Cotton Mather was so shaken by the incident that he wrote in his diary that he needed to devote a sermon to preparing children to stand before God in the event that they suffered an early death. Boston's upper class had been doing what they could to get away from the crowded roadways by building their homes away from the streets, by traveling in covered carriages, and by sending their servants out to do the shopping for them. But if they wanted goods, Boston's wealthiest either had to send out their servants to potentially get swindled by street peddlers, or they had to mix with the common folks themselves. The solution, in their eyes, involved building large marketplaces, places with respectable merchants, where businesses would be thoroughly regulated. Ideally, the establishment of a sizable marketplace would reduce the number of pedestrians clogging the streets, purchasing goods from street vendors. And furthermore, Boston had been falling behind other contemporary cities that had already established these marketplaces. To quote Jonathan Beagle, the upper class felt that the construction of one or more market houses would signal the community's commitment to order, urban improvement, and cultural refinement. It was amidst this tumult over street peddlers and marketplaces where Peter Faneuil enters into our story. The individual who funded Faneuil Hall was a first-generation American. His parents were prominent French Huguenots, as in French Protestants. They had fled to New York after the King of France revoked the Edict of Nantes and began persecuting non-Catholics. After his father died in the 17 teens, Peter and his brother moved to Boston, where their Uncle Andrew was a very successful businessman. Over his lifetime, Peter Faneuil made money trading in tobacco, rum, molasses, manufactured goods, and enslaved individuals. When he was 38, his Uncle Andrew died. Peter received the vast majority of his estate. Suddenly, Peter Faneuil went from being a prosperous individual to one of the wealthiest men in Boston. So after Peter Faneuil inherited his uncle's wealth, he immediately purchased a fancy carriage for himself, which he referred to as his, quote, handsome chariot. In other words, like a lot of American men in their 20s and 30s who see a rise in their income, the first thing that Peter Faneuil did was go out and buy a new car. I speak not from personal experience there. I still love my old Toyota, but I do have quite a few friends who fall into that category. With time, however, Faneuil began to think more and more in terms of putting his fortune to use to benefit his community. Like other individuals in Boston's upper class, he wanted to see the creation of a city marketplace. Faneuil, however, was willing to back up his idea with action. In 1740, when Faneuil proposed building a marketplace with his own money, there was significant opposition to his plan. Many individuals feared that a centralized marketplace would just make it easier for merchants to conspire together and raise prices to an agreed upon rate. The people of Boston might have also wondered whether there was some sort of financial incentive in it for Peter Faneuil. Was this some scheme to enrich himself? I would argue that he was taking a significant risk to finance this marketplace. Just 3 years earlier, a mob had attacked and destroyed a small marketplace near the docks on the exact same site that Peter Faneuil was proposing to build his new market. To increase support for his plan, Faneuil did two things. First, he would give ownership of this grand marketplace entirely to the city of Boston. So this is not for his profit, this is for the public good. And second, Faneuil offered to build a public meeting hall above the marketplace, one that would be capable of holding around 1,000 individuals at once. Boston citizens narrowly approved this plan, and Faneuil Hall was built in 1742. The picture on the screen is from the 1780s. It's the earliest depiction that I could find of the building. I don't know if the black and white picture quite does it justice, for contemporaries found the structure to be pretty impressive. One newspaper described Faneuil Hall as, quote, a noble building, esteemed one of the best pieces of workmanship here, and an ornament to the town. For the next several decades, the space served as a key location for Boston's public meetings, including in the 1760s and the 1770s, as the relationship deteriorated between Britain and the American colonies. Without ever realizing it, Peter Faneuil had helped create an important site tied to the American Revolution. Let's move ahead to the early 1760s. In 1761, Faneuil Hall and a row of shops nearby caught fire. Everything inside of Faneuil Hall was destroyed, but the brick exterior survived the flames. The interior was reconstructed in 1762, becoming available again as a meeting space, just as tensions between the colonists and Britain were starting to flare up. The next year, 1763, is the date that historians use to mark the end of a period of salutary neglect. At first glance, salutary neglect sounds like a very intimidating term, but just think of it as a beneficial lack of attention. For several decades prior to 1763, Britain had placed few responsibilities on the American colonies, while still spending lots of money on soldiers and ships to aid them against the French and the Spanish and various native peoples. During the period of salutary neglect, the American colonists didn't have any representatives in Parliament, but there were few complaints, considering that they faced little to no taxation. Parliament, Britain's foremost legislative body, gave the Americans a lot of leeway to run their own affairs, with royally appointed officials serving as governors and colonial assemblies taking on more of a legislative role. However, in 1763, following the end of the 7 Years' War, Parliament moved away from their relaxed attitude and began devising ways to ensure that American colonists contributed monetarily to their own defense. For example, in 1764, Parliament created the Sugar Act, which placed a tariff of 3 pence on barrels of sugar or molasses that Americans imported from non-British sources. The preamble of the Sugar Act clearly stated that Parliament had passed this law in order to raise money for their military. Not only did the colonists dislike the cost of the tariff, but they also resented that Parliament had designed the legislation so as to give a monopoly to sugarcane planters in the British West Indies at their expense. In 1765, Parliament then followed the Sugar Act by passing another law called the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act is one of my favorites to talk about. It required all sorts of printed materials produced in the colonies, including newspapers, books, court documents, commercial papers, land deeds. All of this needed to carry a stamp issued by British authorities. The Stamp Act constituted the first direct tax on the American colonists. Depending on the type of document, the tax could be as inexpensive as 1 shilling or as expensive as 10 pounds. I would argue that Parliament made a poor strategic choice here. The tax hit writers and newspaper editors rather hard. In other words, some of the people most impacted were the news media of their day, the people who had the power to shape public opinion back in the 1700s. As you might expect then, the Sugar Act and the Stamp Act engendered a lot of resentment from the American colonists, though it took some time for that hostility to build. After the passage of the Sugar Act in 1764, an individual by the name of Samuel Adams was one of the first people in Boston to become seriously alarmed by the legislation. Adams, whose statue is outside of Faneuil Hall, is pictured here on the screen. He attended college at Harvard, but experienced several failures in his professional life. He first failed as a businessman and then as a tax collector. His greatest success in life was as a revolutionary. In the 1760s, he was ahead of other founding fathers in embracing the idea of seeking independence from Britain. A forceful, passionate, and eloquent individual, Adams tended to evoke strong emotions from both his supporters and his opponents alike. One signatory of the Declaration of Independence stated that, quote, "All good Americans ought to have a statue to Adams in their hearts." One British loyalist from Massachusetts, on the other hand, wrote that it would not be hard to get a picture of the devil. All anyone would need was for Samuel Adams to sit for the portrait. As I said before, after Parliament had passed the Sugar Act, Sam Adams was quick to speak out against the law, even as the legislation was not garnering much reaction from other colonists. Adams tried to get the attention of the people of Boston by emphasizing that a tariff on imports was Parliament's first step in the process of finding additional ways to tax the colonists. To quote from a letter Adams wrote to the Massachusetts Colonial Assembly and later read out loud at Faneuil Hall, "For if our trade may be taxed, why not our lands? Why not the produce of our lands and everything we possess or make use of? this we apprehend annihilates our charter right to govern and tax ourselves. If taxes are laid upon us in any shape without our having a legal representation where they are laid, are we not reduced from the character of free subjects to the miserable state of tributary slaves? Obviously, Adams was not a supporter of the Sugar Act itself. But if you're focusing just on that first part of the statement about taxation, you're missing a critical piece. You're missing the critical second part of his statement tied to representation. The colonists could elect members of, say, the lower house of the Massachusetts or Virginia assemblies, but they had no representation in Britain's parliament. They had no representatives who they could vote in or out. There was not a single member of parliament who truly had to answer to the American colonists. Samuel Adams was not making the argument for no taxation. He was making an argument for no taxation without representation. All four words are very key here. James Otis, one of Adams' allies and another frequent speaker at Faneuil Hall, made the case linking taxation and representation even more clearly and succinctly. Writing against the Sugar Act soon after it was passed, he stated that, quote, "No part of His Majesty's dominion can be taxed without their consent." To resolve the situation, Otis could see two options. Either Parliament needed to add American representatives to its ranks if it wanted to tax the colonists, or if the British government did not want American members of Parliament, it needed to leave matters of taxation to the colonial legislatures, where the Americans actually had a vote, where the colonists actually had a real voice. Together, Samuel Adams and James Otis made these arguments to the people of Boston, oftentimes at Faneuil Hall. Faneuil Hall was a particularly useful venue for these two men. Not only was it large enough to accommodate huge crowds of people, but as a separate space from the colonial assembly, Adams and Otis could speak to the people of their city without royal officials looming nearby. As the months passed, more and more individuals in Boston grew angry over the situation, to the point where protesters were hanging effigies of British tax collectors, and a mob attacked and burned down the home of a prominent royal official. While the violent action did reinforce that the colonists were deadly serious in their opposition to the Stamp Act, the actions hurt the image of those who wanted the legislation repealed. Amidst this violence, then, Faneuil Hall was a very real asset. Jonathan Beagle, one of the scholars whose work I relied on as I wrote this presentation, made a fascinating point about this building. If mob violence was the only form of protest against the Stamp Act, it would be easy for British officials to dismiss American concerns. However, Faneuil Hall was an established and well-respected meeting place, a place where community leaders like Adams and Otis were giving earnest, eloquent, moving speeches against the legislation. In other words, Beagle argues that Faneuil Hall gave the colonists a degree of legitimacy and respectability that the Stamp Act's opponents desperately needed if they were to ever be effective. In the face of this pressure, in 1766, Parliament made adjustments to its legislation. Lawmakers reduced the tariff on sugar and molasses from 3 pence per barrel down to 1 pence, and they also abolished the Stamp Act. After learning that the British were revoking the Stamp Act, Faneuil Hall held a celebration for the colonists as they passed resolutions of gratitude for the members of Parliament that had repealed the stamp tax. At the same time as Parliament was modifying its tax laws, though, its members were also debating the question of representation that Adams and Otis had raised. At least one speaker, Charles Pratt, embraced the idea that matters of taxation did need to be left to the colonial assemblies, given that Americans lacked representation in Parliament. Pratt, however, was vastly outnumbered in Parliament. He garnered the support of just 4 other members. On a voice vote, lawmakers passed the Declaratory Act of 1766, which stated that Parliament, in nice old-fashioned language, had hath and of right ought to have full power and authority to make laws and statutes of sufficient force and validity to bind the colonies and people of America in all cases whatsoever. Again, Parliament, under the Declaratory Act, had full power and authority to make laws to bind the colonies and the people of America in all cases whatsoever. On a simple voice vote, Parliament had made clear that they held the authority to levy taxes and tariffs on the colonists, regardless of their lack of political representation. In 1767, several months after the passage of the Declaratory Act, a British publication called the London Magazine reprinted the speech that Pratt had given in the House of Lords. The London Magazine summarized Pratt's arguments with the 4-word phrase, "No taxation without representation." The rhyme encapsulated all the points that Samuel Adams and James Otis had been making for the past several years. Eventually, many American colonists embraced the 4-word phrase as a revolutionary slogan, but in Boston, it was Adams, it was Otis, it was Faneuil Hall that helped popularize the broader ideal that all citizens needed actual representation in the legislative bodies governing them. To get back to our timeline, Samuel Adams and his allies had gotten a brief victory when the British had abolished the Stamp Act, but other parliamentary actions stoked their resentment yet again. In 1765, Parliament had passed something called the Quartering Act, which required that colonial governments provide room and board to any British forces stationed in the town. It was yet another way that Britain could save money on the cost of protecting the colonies. But during peacetime, Britain had little need to send troops to garrison in Boston. 2 years after the passage of the Quartering Act, however, trouble was brewing in the city yet again because of more new legislation, this time something called the Townshend Duties. The Townshend Duties taxed a number of goods imported into the colonies, such as paper, lead, glass, and tea. Faneuil Hall was poised to play a key role yet again. Not only did the colonists organize protests on the streets of Boston, but Adams utilized Faneuil Hall to launch a citywide boycott of goods imported from Britain. Amidst the backlash to the Townshend Acts, Britain decided to utilize the Quartering Act and sent several thousand soldiers into Boston. By September of 1768, the city had essentially turned into an armed garrison. There were now almost as many imperial soldiers in the city as there were white male residents over the age of 16. There were plenty of downsides to the troops' presence. The influx of soldiers brought about a rise in petty crime and prostitution. The men were quartered across Boston, including in private homes and even in Faneuil Hall itself. The British placed sentries outside public buildings and checkpoints throughout the city. If that wasn't enough, the soldiers also added a cannon pointing directly towards the colonial assembly. For Samuel Adams, the presence of the British military helped convince him, ahead of other founding fathers, of the need for American independence. The rhetoric heard around Faneuil Hall, at least once the British soldiers had finally vacated it, was becoming more and more revolutionary in nature. Adams and his allies responded by doing what they could to annoy and sometimes outright harass the British regiments stationed in the city. The harassments turned deadly in the March of 1770. Not far from Faneuil Hall, children had been pelting a British guard with snowballs, as kids do. As the soldier called in for reinforcements, several working-class Americans rushed over to combat the British, beating at the soldiers with cudgels and throwing projectiles at them. The British initially held their ground, but after one soldier was knocked down, he grabbed his gun and fired directly into the bunched-up colonists. With one shot fired, other soldiers then discharged their weapons, killing or mortally wounding 5 more of the colonists. Adams wasted no time putting the event we now call the Boston Massacre to his use. He drew a crowd the next day at Faneuil Hall as he delivered a blazing speech demanding that the 2 regiments occupying the city be withdrawn immediately. Adams then led a small group to talk with Lieutenant Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson first claimed that he didn't have the authority to order the removal of troops, but then he contradicted himself when he offered to remove the specific regiment that had been involved in the altercation the day before. Adams pointed out that, if Hutchinson could send off 1 regiment, he obviously had the authority to send off both regiments. As Hutchinson dithered, Adams threatened that thousands of farmers and militiamen from the areas surrounding Boston were prepared to come in and attack the British if they did not withdraw. This was not exactly an idle threat, in that the colonists from outlying areas of Boston were getting whipped up by rumors of a massacre with far more than 5 casualties. Hutchinson ultimately gave in, supported by the British commander, who feared for his reputation if his troops got caught outnumbered and then got beaten by militiamen and farmers. The British withdrew to an island fort out in the harbor, giving Sam Adams a political victory and giving the town of Boston some breathing room away from the British soldiers. The colonists were further heartened when the British decided to withdraw most of the duties imposed by the Townshend Acts. Parliament viewed the legislation as bad for British trade, but kept the duty on just one item, tea, in order to reassert their authority over the colonists. Time after time, Faneuil Hall had served as a focal point of American resistance to British policies. Samuel Adams used the space as a rallying point amidst the turmoil over the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Duties, and the Boston Massacre. Adams was in the vanguard of the resistance, and there's a reason his statue rests proudly outside of Faneuil Hall. In 1773, Parliament could not resist passing yet another law affecting Boston, this time granting the British East India Company a monopoly trading in the American colonies. Once again, Adams took the lead. You guys are familiar with this story, organizing and executing the Boston Tea Party in response to Parliament's laws. Furious that Adams had, quote unquote, made tea with salt water by dumping it in the harbor, Parliament responded by passing new legislation to punish the city. First, lawmakers closed Boston's harbor until they paid for the tea. Second, Parliament would no longer allow Boston to elect some of their own officials, and instead made almost every position in the city one that was subject to appointment by the British government. Third, given that the previous Quartering Act had expired, Parliament went ahead and passed a new version just for Boston, forcing the city to host British soldiers once more. Finally, in a blow to Faneuil Hall itself, Britain's government restricted the number of town meetings that the people of Boston could have. Ironically, Sam Adams' actions in the Tea Party had the effect of lessening the importance of Faneuil Hall. Many other American colonies responded angrily to Parliament's punitive legislation against Boston. As the British cracked down on Boston and other cities like Philadelphia rose to the center of the independence movement, Faneuil Hall declined in importance. Samuel Adams left the city in 1774 to attend the First Continental Congress. Town meetings still continued at Faneuil Hall, but they grew rather mundane to the point where the royal governor let the meetings continue, even though they were technically illegal now due to Parliament's legislation. Yet Faneuil Hall's story does not end in 1774. Over the course of the 1800s, the people of Boston began highlighting the structure's importance to America's independence movement. In the 1760s, Samuel Adams was organizing and strategizing against the British government from the floor of Faneuil Hall years before other colonies seriously began their push for independence. Between Adams' early leadership and the way he and James Otis embedded the principle of no taxation without representation in the minds of the people of Boston, by the mid-1800s, Faneuil Hall had garnered the nickname of the Cradle of Liberty. The people of Boston embraced this nickname as a way to further reinforce their city's importance in America's drive for independence. In 1806, the city renovated the building, expanding its square footage dramatically and adding another floor to the structure. The first floor has remained a market, a very busy market, to this day. For those of you who might happen to enjoy a beer in Boston on a warm summer's day, from what I understand, they recently added a Sam Adams tap room. The third floor largely became an assembly for the city's militia. Finally, the second floor, pictured here on the screen, stayed a meeting hall, but it gradually filled with the pictures and busts of Revolutionary War heroes, politicians, abolitionists, and suffragists, many of whom had delivered addresses at Faneuil Hall. In fact, an array of individuals found Faneuil Hall to be an ideal place to hold rallies and give speeches. Over the course of the mid-1800s, Boston's anti-slavery advocates saw the Cradle of Liberty as a natural fit when they spoke of liberating enslaved individuals. For suffragists, for those fighting for the right of women to vote, it was not the building's nickname exactly that they needed. It was Faneuil Hall's legacy in regards to the issue of representation. In particular, I want to quickly highlight visits to Faneuil Hall by two suffragists, Lucy Stone and her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell. As Lucy Stone spoke in 1873 for the Women's Suffrage Association at an event at Faneuil Hall, she gave her address, and across the room, the suffragists had hung a banner. On that banner were the words, "Taxation without representation is tyranny." If you think about the matter for a second, the parallel to Faneuil Hall's past becomes clear. Women were subject to taxation, just like men were, and yet until 1920, roughly half of the adult population could not vote for representatives in their own national government. One of Stone's fellow speakers even invoked the memory of Samuel Adams, claiming that if he were alive in 1873, he would be standing in his usual spot in Faneuil Hall, leading yet another fight for political representation. If you look up at the screen, the bust of Lucy Stone is pictured there on, my left. She's sitting there amidst the busts and paintings of individuals like Peter Faneuil, George Washington, Daniel Webster, and John Adams. 2 decades after she spoke at Faneuil Hall, Lucy Stone passed away in 1893, with her last words asking, or perhaps telling those around her to, quote, "Make the world better." Her daughter, Alice Stone Blackwell, took up Lucy Stone's mantle, speaking out on behalf of women, but also on behalf of a range of disadvantaged groups. For example, Blackwell was instrumental in helping Armenian Americans in the late 1800s and early 1900s. This group of Christians had fled persecution in the Ottoman Empire by coming to the United States. Blackwell worked hard to assist hundreds of Armenian individuals, helping them settle in and find jobs throughout Massachusetts. When Boston's Armenian community set up an event in Blackwell's honor, they chose Faneuil Hall, where her mother had spoken a few decades earlier. As I've worked on this talk, I've begun to wonder if Peter Faneuil's family history played a role in the decision to host Blackwell at Faneuil Hall. Perhaps the organizers were drawing a comparison between a family of French Huguenots fleeing religious persecution and the plight of Armenian Christians in the Middle East. Honestly, when I think about Faneuil Hall, I'm glad that it has continued to be used over the centuries. As various groups have utilized the Cradle of Liberty, they've illustrated our country's capacity to change for the better. The struggles and sacrifices of each generation have helped broaden our understanding of liberty and reinforce the importance of political representation. I feel genuinely passionate about the building and its history, so when the 3D Journeys Committee asked if I'd be willing to give a talk about a topic related to Boston, it did not take me all that long to settle on Faneuil Hall as my focus for today. Not only does it have such a rich history, but I also thought you might enjoy seeing pictures of me as a grad student in my mid-20s, back when I visited Faneuil Hall and the Old North Church. For those of you who are attending the trip itself, both of these attractions, both of these sites are well worth the visit. Thank you very much.